Growing up in the bustling city, Liam never imagined he'd inherit a remote cabin on the coast of Maine from his grandparents. Though quaint, it was secluded, nestled deep in the woods, with only the sound of crashing waves and distant bird calls filling the silence. Alone for the weekend, Liam was meant to tidy up and make sure everything was in order. He had no neighbors for miles, no cell service, and an old landline that had long since stopped working. On the second day, while reading in the living room, he heard a loud crash on the porch like something heavy had fallen. His heart skipped a beat. Cautiously, he peered out through the front window and saw an old muddy baseball cap lying on the wooden steps. He hadn't seen anyone come down the road all day, and the sight of the cap filled him with an eerie sense of unease. He felt a chill run down his spine as he stepped outside and looked around. Finding no one, he returned inside, locking the door. He reached into the hallway closet for his grandfather's old hunting rifle. Although he had never fired it, having it nearby provided some comfort. But as he held his breath, he heard a faint creak from upstairs. The floorboards groaned above him, each step seemingly louder than the last. Slowly he climbed the narrow stairs, heart pounding, until he reached the landing at the top. The hallway was pitch black, except for the sliver of light beneath his parents' bedroom door. The sound had come from in there. Taking a shaky breath, Liam tiptoed to the door and pressed his ear against it. He heard a faint rustling, and then, chillingly, the sound of someone muttering to themselves. Terrified, he backed away, feeling as if he'd stepped into a nightmare. As he descended the stairs, his eyes fell on a slip of paper. Hurriedly, he scrawled a note. "Whoever you are, leave." He slid it under the door, turned, and bolted outside. Running through the woods, he reached his nearest neighbor, who called the local sheriff. When they returned to the cabin, the room was empty. But in the attic, they found something strange. A rolled-up bed mat, half-eaten food, and a photograph of Liam's family, one he hadn't seen in years. It seemed the stranger had been watching them, possibly for a long time. Though he left the cabin that day, the feeling never left him. Sometimes, when alone, he swears he can hear the creak of footsteps upstairs and the faint murmur of a voice. The man was never found, but he left a mark on Liam that he'll never forget.
Nina, a 20-year-old aspiring photographer, lives in a small coastal town called Seabrook. It's a quiet, misty place with waves crashing along cliffs and the occasional lighthouse casting beams across the night. While her parents are away on a weekend business trip, Nina decides to visit the lighthouse alone to capture the perfect nighttime photo for her portfolio. She knows her way around the secluded paths along the cliffs and brings her camera and flashlight. At the lighthouse, a middle-aged man, Mark, approaches her while she's setting up her camera. He's polite at first, asking if she's familiar with the area and if she knows any good nearby trails. Nina is cautious but answers briefly. When she mentions she lives nearby, he seems overly interested. She makes an excuse about needing to finish her photos and starts packing up, feeling uneasy. As she walks back along the winding path toward town, Nina realizes she can hear footsteps behind her, barely audible over the ocean's roar. She speeds up, hoping he was just a tourist heading back to his car. But the footsteps match her pace and stay close, even when she picks up speed. At one point, she glances back and catches a glimpse of Mark's silhouette in the mist, far enough back to keep her guessing, but close enough to keep her on edge. Bling! But the image of his face stays with her. Every time she closes her eyes, she sees him lurking in the darkness, watching and waiting. Nina reaches her house and locks herself inside, feeling a temporary sense of relief. Later that night, as she's editing her photos, she gets an eerie feeling that she's being watched. She glances out her window, and just as she's about to turn away, she sees someone standing near the edge of her yard, half hidden by a tree. It's Mark. He's staring straight at her house. Her heart races, and she quickly locks all the doors and calls the police, explaining that someone is lurking outside her home. The police arrive, search the property, and assure her that he's gone, promising to do more patrols in the area. They suggest she stay with a friend for the night. She calls her close friend Lily, who offers her a place to stay. The following evening, after a sleepless night at Lily's, she returns to her house to grab some things, hoping that the man has finally moved on. As she's packing up, she hears a creak outside her door and cautiously checks the peephole. To her horror, Mark is right there, grinning. She bolts to her friend's car parked outside, heart pounding, barely able to start the engine before he's knocking on her window, calling her name in a soft, taunting tone. As Nina drives away, the adrenaline slowly fades, but she can't shake the feeling of being watched. When she gets to her friend Lily's house, she decides to check the photos she took at the lighthouse, hoping to distract herself from the ordeal. She scrolls through the images, zooming in on each one, hoping her favorite hobby will bring her some comfort. But as she reaches the last few photos, her stomach tightens. In one shot, barely visible in the shadows of the cliffs, she spots a figure Mark's face, slightly blurry but unmistakable, staring straight into the camera. She quickly clicks through the rest, and there he is again in another shot, closer this time, watching her with that same unsettling smile. The realization chills her to the core. He'd been watching her long before their encounter, following her even as she focused on her camera. She deletes the photos in a panic, her hands tremor.
Theo had been in Harper's Cove for a few weeks, and while he loved the ocean view, the isolation sometimes got to him. His family's house sat near the cliffs, surrounded by tall, looming trees, and that night, alone with his game, the whole setting felt almost too quiet. After his parents left to visit friends in town, Theo settled down for a long night of gaming. The fog was thick and cold, pressing against the windows. Absorbed in his game, he barely noticed when the doorbell rang, the sound muffled but persistent. Pausing, Theo frowned, glancing at the clock, 10:34 p.m. He wasn't expecting anyone. Maybe Mom and Dad forgot something, he thought, walking cautiously toward the door. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady. "Just an old lady who needs help," came a feeble, raspy voice. Theo leaned toward the door's peephole. Standing outside in the mist was an elderly woman, her smile stretched and strange. She had her hands behind her back, as though hiding something. Theo's instincts told him to keep his distance. I can't let strangers in," he replied, trying to sound polite. "There's a library down the road. They might have a phone." The woman's smile faltered. Her eyes seemed to darken. "It's rude to turn away someone in need, dear," she said, her voice growing more insistent. Theo's heart raced. "Sorry, I'm really sorry," he mumbled, closing the door and walking away, a chill prickling the back of his neck. He wanted to shake off the encounter, but he couldn't. Suddenly, a tapping began at his bedroom window, faint but clear, a rhythmic clinking, like metal against glass. Theo's bedroom was on the side of the house, and his window was closed. He turned toward it slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. With a deep breath, he moved to the window, pulling the blind up just a bit. Peering in from the outside was the same woman, her eyes wide, smile wider. Her hand held something, a knife, tapping lightly against the glass. Theo stumbled back, covering his mouth to keep from gasping. He turned off his computer screen, plunging the room into darkness, and back toward the door, deciding to wait things out in the living room. Maybe she'd leave if she thought he wasn't there. Barely 5 minutes had passed when the doorbell rang again, but this time there was a hard knock alongside it. Theo crept to the door, his heart pounding. Through the peephole, he saw a man this time, tall and grim, standing exactly where the woman had been. He looked younger than her, but there was a strange resemblance, as though they were related. "Have you seen my sister?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. Theo froze. "She said she needed help. She can be. Very persuasive." Theo swallowed, uncertain. "She went down the hill. You can check there," he replied, hoping the stranger would leave. But the man's expression never changed. "Why don't you let me in? I'd be quick," he said, his smile as cold and unsettling as hers had been. Theo stepped back, deciding to ignore him. When he peeked through the blinds of the living room window, though, the yard was empty. The man, the woman, both had vanished into the fog, without a sound. He spent the rest of the night locked in his room, lying in bed with the light on, clutching a flashlight in one hand. Sleep didn't come until dawn. The next morning, when Theo told his parents what had happened, they dismissed it as a nightmare. But as Theo walked past his bedroom window later, he noticed something chilling, a smudged handprint on the outside glass. He hadn't imagined the strangers in the fog, and as he turned back toward the sea, he thought he saw two figures on the beach, standing side by side, smiling as they watched the house,